Okay, so without further delay, could I now introduce you all to this morning's session chair, Sylvia MacDonald. I'm not sure Sylvia needs much introduction, but Sylvia studied with the Chartered Institute of Public Relations before doing a 3-year diploma course in journalism. She says the whole business of daily bakery manufacture and distribution of the most delicious products made by some of the friendliest and most passionate people is what drew her to this trade, and she loves writing about it. Having interviewed everyone from craft bakers to Jonathan Warburton, ingredient manufacturers to Justin King, she says bakery is primarily a very challenging business, and she looks forward to speakers tackling some of those challenges this morning. Could I all ask you to welcome Sylvia?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Paul. Shall we get started right away? I'm trusting technology here. Our first speaker is known to many of you. A leading scientist in the bakery sector, Gary Tucker is at the forefront of changes happening in product development. Most relevant of all at the moment is sugar. Now, Gary has addressed the society before on sugar, but have things changed? Oh, they certainly have. Can we stay one step ahead of government and reduce sugar in cakes? It is a question vital to this sector. To give the answers, please welcome leading scientist Gary Tucker.
Okay, thank you very much. Just wave at me at the back if you can't hear, even though you won't know that I'm not saying anything. So, delighted to have the BSB here and see so many familiar faces. That's really good. My subject of reducing sugar in cakes is an incredibly topical issue, so much so that I keep on changing my slides slightly, and apologies to Jim, wherever Jim is located. There he is. The version I sent to you 2 days ago is slightly different from this one. And even this morning I wanted to change it because there's so much information coming out. So I'll give you, as best I can, an update on where we are with sugar issues, some of the challenges that we face the industry in its entirety. I'll talk about some of the functions of sugar, which I mentioned in the talk, was it a year ago or 2 years ago? I can't remember. And I'm going to focus on a couple of those functions, which I think are the most relevant to the challenges that the baking sector faces. And then a few words about the future. And this is where I have changed things a little bit, because this reduction that the government wished to recommend to the industry, and I think that's the right word, the 20% reduction, does have some quite major implications for the cake baking sector. So in terms of the update on sugar issues, now some of these slides I will go through quite quickly because they're not bakery relevant, but it's good to have the background. So this one is about what's happening in the drink sector, which is clearly a target for sugar reduction. So there's draft legislation that is already prepared and ready to be implemented in April of next year. And down at the bottom, assuming that is a pointer, so the government is hoping to raise 520 million in the first year. Whether it will or not remains to be seen, because already the major drinks companies are making changes in reducing the sugar in their products. Now that's relatively straightforward for the drink sector, without belittling that sector, because the sugar is there primarily for flavour. So it's not as complex as it is with the bakery sector. I put this slide in because there are certain claims that can be made, but not many are relevant to cake. Clearly, it's unlikely a cake is going to be low sugar, unless it's a savoury cake, and that'll have a completely different flavour. Similarly, sugar-free, that's not really likely. No added sugars, possibly. reduced sugar is certainly a claim that can be made, and the rules haven't changed on that. It's still, you need to make a 30% reduction in sugar compared to a comparable product. So that still exists, but it's a challenge, 30%. So what's happening? Well, when I wrote this, or started to write this a few weeks ago, there was a lot that was in draft. It's now come out in print. The bakery sector is certainly going to follow the drink sector in one way or another, because it's been highlighted that bakery products, and these are words taken from the public health PHE document that was out at the end of March. So bakery products are high in free sugars but offer little nutritional value. So those aren't my words, they're straight from the PHE document. Hence they're a target. What PHE are looking for is 20% reduction across categories by 2020. These are sales weighted averages. Now in some sectors, I was talking to Gordon Paulson about this earlier and at the Federation of Bakers about morning goods. There are some products within the morning goods sector that are high in sugar, but the sales are quite low. So to achieve the 20% reduction across the category could be a challenge. Cakes is probably different because most cakes do have a high level of sugar and the levels are not as variable as perhaps they are in morning goods. The recommendations from the PHE, and if you want, I probably should say the document looks like that. I didn't print the whole lot out, it's about 110 pages, but I've read the relevant sections quite carefully about bakery. They are suggesting that these are the three approaches that sectors need to take, or the most likely outcomes. The first one is there will be a reformulation exercise to reduce sugar. Now, accepting that that might not be possible in all cases, there will be a portion size reduction that will be possible. And thirdly, shifting consumers' purchasing habits towards lower sugar versions of that same product or a similar product. So those are the three recommendations from PHE that the bakery sector has to work in. Something that is quite interesting in this is it now includes all sugars, whether they're natural or added. So the fact that you're using honey or some other natural material is really quite irrelevant now. It contains sugars, and if those sugars can be analysed, they count. And the last point is a great one for the cake sector. You have to do this without increasing the saturated fat or the calories. Now that's, when you think about it, you think, yeah, that's easy to do, but it isn't, because if you take sugar out, the proportion of the other ingredients goes up. Fat is a very important ingredient in cake manufacture. It has many functions. So when we reduce sugar, the proportion of fat will go up. So that's quite a challenge for the baking sector and for cake. And again, this is taken from the PHE document, which has come out within the last few weeks. So they recognise businesses will need to make or find technological solutions to achieve these sugar reductions. It's nice that they encourage industry to consider simple solutions first. I don't actually know what they are for cake, but we'll come to that later. And then they highlight some of the categories that are most relevant to children, because that's of primary concern to PHE. And here we've got a number here that, well, when you look through the list, thinking about the baking sector, there's actually quite a lot there that comes into the category of baking sector. And cakes there I've underlined because that's the subject of this particular presentation. I put these, there's two slides about sugar content and measurement, which is really quite interesting because you can only reduce if you can measure it. And it's important to know, first of all, how we define sugars and then how we measure sugars. And so, in terms of the regulation, the EU regulation that defines what we need to reduce and measure and label, it's monosaccharides and disaccharides, which is actually quite interesting because there are quite a number of sugars that aren't mono and disaccharides, but they're not within that regulation. So monosaccharides would be glucose, fructose, galactose, disaccharides, maltose, sucrose and lactose. So the higher sugars, such as maltotriose, and there are various other higher sugars that are based on a molecule of 3 glucose units, those aren't included in this. I also don't know what it means about the xylans, which are a 5-carbon molecule. They're certainly not a monosaccharide and they're not a disaccharide. So again, life is never straightforward. So even within the regulation, it's starting to get a bit complex. And then the way that you measure sugar is also not straightforward. The most accurate, and actually the most common, is HPLC. It gives you a profile, but it is expensive. There are enzymatic measure methods, but they are very specific because enzymes are specific in their action. Then there are other methods, titration, refractometers, but you couldn't really use those for labelling purposes. So for labelling, it will tend to be HPLC as the method. It's not perfect. And I'll come back to one of the imperfections in a little bit. So here's the functionality of sugar. If we're trying to reduce sugar in cake, we have to address at least these 7 functions. There are probably others as well, but these are the main 7 that we always focus on when we're either doing a training course or a product development activity. The 2 in red are the ones that I want to spend the time on this morning. Flavour and sugar's action as a humectant. So the first one, the role in sweetness. It's obvious that sugar gives flavour, but it is one of the most important categories. Interestingly, industrial cakes are all very sweet. And when I say industrial cakes, I mean cakes that you buy in the retailers. They have to have a shelf life that allows time within the store plus time at home, and in order to get that shelf life they need sugar, and they are sweet. So in terms of flavour, I think most people would agree we could take sugar out by maybe even 20% and it's not going to negatively affect the flavour. Now that's good news, because most of the other categories of what sugar does in a product is not such good news. But for sweetness, I think we can deal with that relatively straightforwardly. And I put some data here, and I've got more data later, just to illustrate what levels of sweetness we've got. So here we've got the pound cake, which is one of the most common formulations or recipes for a cake, particularly if you bake at home. It's a very straightforward recipe. Even those of us who've got useless memories can remember how much of each ingredient to put into a pound cake. And when you look at the proportions per 100 grams, 28 grams of sugar per 100 gram in a pound cake. Now it will vary from pound cake to pound cake, really depending on what type of fat you use, whether it's a margarine which contains some liquid, other little bit of sugars. So, but approximately 28 grams per 100 of sugar. Madeira cake, which is a rich or an enriched cake, will have more, about 34 grams of sugar. I put wholemeal bread in there just to illustrate the difference between a bread formulation and a cake formulation. Not that we really need to have that. What's really interesting about this is that PHE would like a 20% reduction in sugar by 2020. If you look at the sales weighted average figures for cake, they're at 34.9 grams. That's been calculated from between 100 and 200 different samples. So that Madeira cake is quite representative. If you do a 20% reduction, you actually bring the sugar level down very close to what the pound cake already is. So, in terms of sweetness, I don't think we have an issue. We can take sugar down from the current quite high levels, and we still have a product that is acceptable. If we want to use alternative sugars that have different levels of sweetness, then fructose here is a very convenient one, but I don't think it would be very good. I don't think the PHE would be very happy that the industry is being forced along using fructose. You know, high fructose corn syrup has got such bad press in the USA as one of the causes of obesity. So it's driving the wrong behaviour. But there are other options. Unfortunately, these high intensity sweeteners are not an option for bakery products. But fructose is. It's sweeter than sucrose. However, personal view, I don't think there's a problem in reducing sweetness by taking sugar out. There are other options that could be possible. Using high intensity regions, fruit is a good example. Fruit is very high sugar, dried fruit I should say, and so when you bite through a product that has these high intensity regions, you get a sudden hit of sugar. The salt industry, I suppose you could call it, has tried that in terms of trying to put crystals of salt on top of bread products. There was a product called Sodalo, which was effectively more like a hollow crystal, so high surface area, you've got a high intensity. It's all very well, except in solution these things don't work, and over shelf life you get migration of water and you get an equilibration of water activity within a product, an equilibration of sugar content. So for the longer shelf life products, these high intensity regions don't really work. I think if the shelf life was 1 to 2 days, as with some breads, there is a possibility, but not for cake. An area that's of great interest to us in terms of flavour is about sourdough and sour starters, for a number of reasons. One is to do with the flavour, and you do get different flavour compounds generated with sours. Now, children may not find those particularly attractive, but to an adult they can be very attractive. And I'll come back to sours a little bit later because they have a big relevance to shelf life. I won't say much about the second of the functions, role as a bulking agent, other than that line in red about some of the alternatives that if we take sugar out, our product will naturally be smaller because sugar has a physical volume. So we need to put something in there if we want our cake to be the same size. Fibre materials like inulin are very good. But we've had some quite strange results from sugar analysis with inulin, where the amount of sugar in a reduced sugar product has actually gone up, which is not really what you would expect. And when we've calculated it, it's wrong. It shouldn't go up. We're not sure whether it's a result of the sugar analysis methods that are used or whether there's contamination of inulin with sugars. We suspect the latter. And so that's just a word of caution. Inulins are not just inulin. Inulin doesn't have one molecular weight. It has a range. And within that range, there will be smaller sugars present. Some of those are going to come up on the analysis method, which is why I mentioned analysis methods earlier. So you could find, and be very careful, you add inulin and you actually increase your sugar. So just watch out for that. This is, I think, a relatively straight function to sort out. Stabilisation of batters. We want to entrap air in a batter. We want to keep that air within the batter so that as the air bubbles expand, we get that rise of the cake, which is then helped by the raising agent to fill the air bubbles. There are numbers of hydrocolloids, gums, those types of material that also have viscosity increase properties. So that's okay, providing you don't mind adding them on the label. Then Another really interesting one, this is sort of the scientist in me coming out here, is that sugar affects the temperature at which proteins coagulate and starches gelatinize. When those two things happen, you get a very, very significant rise in viscosity of the batter. And that makes it harder for the cake to rise once that viscosity has changed from batter to effectively a set cake. Sugar raises that temperature, and it can raise it from around 60 degrees C up to almost 100 degrees C. So that's a very big change in temperature. And for the industrial cake, if that's the right term, or the retailer cake that has a high level of sugar for shelf life, the setting point of that cake will be around 90 to 95 degrees Celsius. So it remains soft for longer. And that's an interesting property. Now, if this works, we have these lovely movies that if any of you have been to training courses at Campden BRI, you would have seen these. These were taken a few years ago for the high sugar cake, which has now disappeared, and for muffins. They're taken in an X-ray camera, and they show the way that these two high sugar products rise during baking. And you can see that the rise carries on almost to the end of baking. Then there's just a little settling back. Now that can do that because there's high sugar in there. If that was a low sugar product, that rise would be stopped earlier. So sugar has this really complex roll-in setting. The roll-in colour is another obvious one. Caramelisation and Maillard are the two reactions. So we don't need to dwell on that. Here's the big one for sugar reduction. Roll as a humectant. Sugar reduces the water activity. So as the water activity changes, here on this graph, you're not supposed to be able to read the scale, that doesn't matter. It goes from 80% ERH to 92. And so let's go from the right-hand side. So if we go down in water activity, we go up in shelf life. Obvious. Take sugar out, and the water activity comes down. So a 20% reduction in sugar means our water activity has gone down, not by 20%, because it's not a linear relationship, but it's gone down. And that means the shelf life will be different, it'll be lower. And that really is important for cakes that need to have a long shelf life. A few options. We can kill the mould on the surface, because the contamination is mostly on the surface, and it happens after the bake, so we can kill it, or we can do something to slow that growth down. There are various alternatives for killing the mould. Products like Heinz sponge pudding in a can have been around for years and years, and I thought that was quite a nice example because it shows a product that's had a heat treatment as well as the bake. Now the bake happens in the can, but it has a heat treatment to kill the mould, and the shelf life is many, many months. Quality-wise, it's not great because it's a staled product, but you don't eat it cold, you eat it warm. And there are quite a few other similar products like that that have more cake-like structures, such as these sort of Aunt Bessie's puddings that are in plastic pots. Their structure is a much better developed structure. There's also surface sprays, UV, pulse light. You can do that if you want. Or you can add a different humectant. We love salt as a humectant. It's brilliant. Approximately, it's 11 times more effective than sucrose. Great. But of course, salt is another target for PHE, so we can't use salt too much. Fructose is also better than sucrose as a humectant. So again, that could be driving the behaviour towards using high fructose corn syrups in cakes, which personally I don't think is the behaviour we really want to be driving by the 20% reduction. So now we look a little bit at sourdoughs or sour starters and the benefits of that. Sourdough cake, again, has been around for years. Most of us have probably had German friendship cake passed to us, and we've kept the starter alive for a few days and then it's died, and that's that. You never visit it again. But there is potential within the sourdough, and that's because there are numerous antimicrobial compounds generated by the bacteria and the natural yeasts. And they're the same materials that we can also deliberately add to stop growth of microorganisms, such as the ethanoic or acetic acid, propionic acid, sorbic acid, lactic acid. There are a whole range of organic acids that are generated. Interestingly, what they do, they slow the mold growth, and so the shelf life will be longer. But, and there's always a but to these things, they're more effective in a low pH cake. So if you have a neutral pH cake, then these acids tend to be in their salt form, and that isn't a preservative. They need the pH to force the equilibrium to the acid form, and then they do the preservation. And here's a few pictures to show how we worked on a pound cake, and I probably should have said at the start that I like my presentations to be, we have a start, a middle and a happy ending. This one's got a start and middle and work in progress. We haven't got the happy ending yet. So we have a number of cakes based on the pound cake as the control. And what we've done here, we've added a flour and water to that pound cake recipe. Either, like that top one there, we haven't done any fermentation with it, it's literally added. So that's our true control. And then we've added a sour to this one. Third one, we've added our flour and water and just allowed it to ferment for an hour. This one, we've added the sour with a 1 hour ferment. This one is added the flour and water, 2 hours, and the sour in 2 hours. Structurally, they're fine. We've got lots of data behind that with C-cell and texture analysis. Of this, again, lots of data. Interestingly, the pH hasn't gone down very much, but we haven't done a lot of fermentation with this. So there is scope to get that pH further down and help the shelf life. But we were seeing, probably start at the bottom here, for the pound cake, we got 31 days shelf life out of that pound cake. Now that's because our facilities in our bakery are actually quite clean. If you have a very contaminated surface, the calculations are about 10 days for that mold-free shelf life. And that's another way of extending shelf life, by using clean facilities. But the sour did give an improvement of shelf life against what really is the control, 23 days. Now it's not much, but we haven't depressed the pH very much, from 8.05 to 7.34. It's not really enough for these acids to be doing their thing in preservation. So definitely work in progress. And if you think depressing pH is not a good idea, I've pulled out some data here for commercial cakes showing that quite a few of them have lower pHs. Usually it's when preservative is added. There isn't much point adding a preservative if you don't depress the pH. You're just throwing money away. Because these preservatives, like sorbate, prefers a pH of about 5. Propionate prefers a pH of about 6. So if you have a neutral cake, it's not perfect. It's much better to make it slightly acidic. So there are examples of acid cakes, Christmas cake, fruit cakes are 5, 5.4. So in terms of the eating quality, it is possible to make cakes acidic, and they're quite acceptable. And clearly you can see the mold-free shelf life in the far right column here goes up considerably with preservative. And that's the effect that a sour can do. So the sour can give some natural preservative. I'll leave that. I'm not going to talk about the texture softening agent. Air and water are fantastic softening agents for materials. It's all very well, but water doesn't do us any favours for shelf life in terms of mould. So, just coming to some conclusions now. Some disadvantages of sugar replacers. Sucrose is a clean label. So, if we're going to add a hydrocolloid in to help our batter viscosity, goes on the label, it's got an E number. The manufacturing cost is going to increase by adding these additional materials, because sucrose is a cheap ingredient. We will have a different texture. We will have a different flavour. We have to accept that. And I mentioned earlier about the calorie content. It can increase, unfortunately. And I also mentioned about inulin, and beware, it might contain sugars that come up in analysis. So here's the interesting things, the future. Definitely the sugar debate hasn't finished. It's got a long way to run. Bakery products, as we know, are high in sugar. They have to be, for those 7 reasons that I mentioned. But it is very important that the industry does make moves to reduce that sugar. And definitely, I don't think sweetness is the problem. We can take sugar out, and the flavour of that cake will be acceptable. I mean, we all like a pound cake, so that's very close to the target that we need to go down to with a 20% reduction. Apologies for breaking our own system at Campden BRI. The big challenge for the sector is this bottom one here, mould-free shelf life. There are some options. I mentioned killing the mould on the surface, slowing it down with other antimicrobial materials. That's the challenge. I also put this table in just to show examples of commercial cakes, just taken off the internet, off retailer sites, showing for different types of cakes where they currently sit for sugars per 100 gram. The sales weighted average, as I mentioned earlier, is 34.9. If we were to take a 20% reduction, these are the values we would come up with. Now, I think the high ones are to do with icings, which are going to be naturally much higher in sugar. So if you have a product with an icing, you're going to be quite high on the sugar. So your option there, make it thinner. There's not much else you can do. But the interesting thing is that pound cake down here at 28 is really where the 20% reduction for these high sugar cakes will end up at, if we can achieve that. And my final slide is, again, one that I popped a couple of extra bullet points in that Jim won't have seen. So as people in Camden, and particularly the bakery department, know, I am a huge fan of cakes, and I think cakes could have a much bigger role in our diet than they currently have. I won't go into some of the amusing discussions we've had at lunchtime about why that should be, but there is the possibility of reducing sugar. We can do it. Higher fibre, you can get away with it in a cake. The way that the bubbles are formed is not the same as it is in bread. So there's scope to put more fibre in cake, which is of course what we want with the diet. And if we are using sours and extended fermentation, there's some quite strong evidence of the benefits that you get from what those bacteria do, the lactic acid, acetobacter, what that group of bacteria do to the carbohydrates and the fibres that are naturally present in the flour. So that could have a dietary benefit. So now I come to my really they're probably contentious, but are they? Statements I think are so interesting about this 20% reduction and where it's taking us. Cake doesn't require such high quality wheat as bread, because we don't have to generate the gluten structure in the same way as bread. So it's a cheaper option of getting cereal nutrition into our diet. Quite an interesting point. The wheats tend to be higher yielding than bread wheats. It's a more sustainable solution. It's quite an interesting one, that. My next one, it just dawned on me about a couple of days ago when I was doing the calculations for 20% reduction. Most of the current long shelf life cakes, we tend to call them high ratio cakes, but we really need a better term than high ratio. It's an awful term. They use heat treated flour. They have to, because there's more liquid in the formulation, and a conventional flour will not cope with that amount of liquid. So this raises a question. If we have a 20% reduction, which takes us down to the pound cake, you don't need heat-treated flour for a pound cake. What's the future of heat-treated cake flour? That's an interesting point. And then the final interesting point of my alternative future is, what shelf life do we want? Because we can take 20% of the sugar out easily for cakes, and it doesn't affect the taste that adversely, but it will affect the shelf life. If we're prepared to have a shorter shelf life, we can do it now. But the key thing is what shelf life is acceptable and how do we get to that shelf life. So some interesting and quite challenging points there, these last three, about sugar reduction. And I didn't want to leave without just popping that slide up as some unashamed publicity for our Bakery Technology Conference next year, of which the dinner is going to be at the Pudding Club. Many of you have been to the Pudding Club. If you haven't been to the Pudding Club, it's a cracking evening, 7 puddings. You'll do well if you can get 7 puddings down you. I've only done 6. I've never managed it. Stick the dates in your diary, and that's me done.
Gary, stay at the podium, please, if you would. Thank you very much. Well, I'm not a scientist, but I could understand most of that. While you're thinking of some questions to quickly ask Gary, please, there's just one I'd like to ask Gary. I get the impression that government don't really understand why maybe stevia or other ingredients just can't be used in the processing of cake product. I mean, how closely are you liaising with or educating government?
Well, as Campden BRI, we do have discussions with government. We do sit on some committees. The committees that are involved with sugar reduction, we tend to work through Gordon, who's got his hand, because he knows I'm probably going to drop him in it, through the Federation of Bakers, and the Federation of Bakers, NABIN, those sorts of committees that we're active in. And the Federation of Bakers, obviously part of FDS, will liaise with government. Gordon, do you want to say anything about those lovely discussions you've had with government?
About stevia, etc. You mean?
Educating government why you can't just reduce sugar in cakes like you can in drinks.
I think there have been huge discussions with government about the challenges of reducing sugar, and I don't think there are any doubt that there are challenges. And I mean, actually, unlike salt reduction, I think the government has been a lot more in listening mode about the various options to try to reduce sugar. In other words, they haven't just gone for the simple reduction of the actual sugar. They've let you look at portion control and the alternatives of other products to build into the guidelines of 20% reduction. So I think they have been a bit more in listening mode, but they're absolutely adamant that this is an issue regarding obesity, and it has to be countered. I think as far as the artificial sweeteners are concerned, like stevia, that's an EU issue, and depending whether you're in or out, it may be something which, in due course, and it's something interesting that we could look at potentially nationally if the EU doesn't move on the non-availability of artificial sweeteners in bakery products. But there is continuing lobbying discussion about the availability of these artificial sweeteners in bakery products.
Could I ask you to put your hands in the air, please, and Sarah will find you with a microphone. If you've got any questions for Gary on his presentation, or Brian if you're at the back. So please have no worries at all and ask Gary anything you would like on sugar.
Gary,
If you just give your name, please.
Kieran Mitch is my name from Carberry. group. I was very interested in the data that you put up on the sourdough and the fermentation piece. Just curious to know from that set of trials what sort of pH targets you might have in mind for that sort of fermentation, and how long it might take you in the process to get to those targets.
Yeah, thanks for that. Those were our first set of trials where we were just trying to assess what impact there was on pH depression and what mold-free shelf life we were likely to get. We will now be embarking on further trials. My thoughts are we really need to be looking at a pH between 6 and 7, probably closer to 6, but of course it depends on the flavour that we then end up with. That will then mean the organic acids are most effective if we can get that pH down. And then that will also have a positive impact on the mould-free shelf life. So I think it's really looking at about pH 6 to 6.5. Currently we've gone up to 2 hours of fermentation, starting with a sour. I think it's a fair bet to say we're going to need a few more hours of fermentation to get that down. Okay.
Any more questions for Gary, or we'll move on? Don't forget, you can always see him in the break or over lunch, and if you don't like him to ask out loud, you can ask later on. Thank you very much, Gary. Would you put your hand together?